Hello, interwebs, both Twitch and YouTube. So, we're going to be talking about background simulation. And this is something that I and several others have harped on that is a very shallow representation of the galaxy, both politically and economically speaking. Now, there is something here, we'll talk a little bit more about this here in a second, but they're talking here about what the simulation is not. And if you read through this, one can make the argument that how the background simulation operates today is pretty much exactly what was promised several years ago. Now, we'll get into a little bit more specifics here in a couple of minutes. I think the argument could be made that if that's the case, they failed in their design and maybe even their implementation of this thus far. But it does say here what the simulation is not. It does not provide faction command. This will be done by designers by injecting events. Okay, that's fair enough. Although the system should provide aggregate data to help guide these events. I don't know whether it does or not. We don't get to look at the aggregate data. It does not provide fine detailed simulation of human space in the galaxy. Huh. That's unfortunate. I guess if that's the case, one could make the argument the background sim is working as intended. Note note that it does provide the framework for a living galaxy as required in the goals. And from a technical perspective, it says the simulation provides data for NPC traffic generation, modified by local conditions. Technical perspective, it is required for low overhead for processing, overhead for data storage, and low data access requirements. And I'm guessing that the game does follow through on those aspects, because I can't see where, as it stands right now, where this could be very taxing on their system. But again, I'm going to assume that they fulfilled their goals there. But it says here that, in politically speaking, it should create a dynamic and evolving galaxy. Unfortunately, even if you take power play into this consideration, I know that when I pledged, I think it was Aisling Duval a few months ago to get prismatic shields, I was reading on their subreddit that somebody was asking, well, why do we consolidate all the time? And the answer was, well, power play is stagnant. It's reached a point of equilibrium where basically anybody that has profitable systems have already conquered them. And unless somebody screws up for a couple of weeks, there's essentially nowhere to expand to. The game, as far as power play is considered or concerned, is stagnant. So if they're trying to create a dynamic and evolving galaxy, I would make the argument that, at least on that aspect, they have failed. Now, the other argument could be that they're talking about minor factions, and minor factions expanding into neighboring systems, and power play and the minor faction system are completely divorced from each other, which I think is probably the single biggest mistake, is that power play was just the separate layer that really made no sense. It would seem like it would be a lot more sense that if you could pledge to support a minor faction and grow their influence and control and power within the galaxy and competing with other minor factions, I think that would have made a much more dynamic and interesting political gameplay. The other problem is, my understanding is, sometimes it's counterintuitive that you think by running missions and doing certain activities to support your power, or your minor faction rather, that was what causes it to grow and expand and things like that. But at times you've actually got to work against that power in order to set up certain conditions in order to allow that expansion in another system. If their levels are too high, then you got to do missions against them to bring them down, so they'll start a civil war or a war. So it's one of those things that it's actually kind of counterintuitive in places. Generates interesting events. Now, I think that they're going to say that events in terms of this is if the system state changes, and now you go from boon to bust or to outbreak, and it will generate different types of missions. Actually, it'll generate the same types of missions with different flavor text. Like liberating 6 jewels is a piracy mission task. Liberating 6 hostages is the same piracy task, only this time we've changed the flavor text to meet with a different scenario. That's basically their big deal, and they have in past live streams made a very big deal about how it changes that flavor text, which again very few people read after about the first time, and then, oh, it's where do I need to go, how much do I need to get, and how much am I going to get paid? Essentially, is what most people, I believe, actually look at. It says here, respond to player activities. Yes, the background simulation and minor factions do respond to player activities. Respond to injected events. I think that this would mean community goals. I don't know how well that actually works out in terms of injected events. And then respond to generated events chain effect. Some people could argue that this has been implemented now and being further refined in 2.4 with chained missions. To me, what this would be is, or what it should be, would be, okay, you've taken over the control of this neighboring system. Now, 2 or 3 other factions, minor factions, are going to put resources and efforts to stop your expansion further and generate missions related to that task. And I think that a lot of the stuff maybe does go on behind the scenes, but while visualization of it for players have gotten better over time, it's still often hid behind a curtain that we don't get to peek into. The economy, I think, is even worse in terms of many of these respects. It says create a dynamic economy. Now, it is true. Prices are different, and actually the price variation now is more dramatic than it has been in previous patches. That being said, there are several effects that don't, or several things that don't appear to affect anything. Like, you know, some of these stations that are 200, 300,000 light seconds from the station, they should be able to get played data that very few, if any, players ever venture out to them. And as a result, the prices at those locations should be sky high in order to then say, oh, if you are willing to make that 10-minute trek out there, you can sell things at 5 times the price you can at a normal station, or much more regular, and give a little bit more variance of trade routes and stuff like that based on things like distance from the star you jump into. Or they eventually end up introducing micro jumps to the as a solution, which again is in the design documents. Wouldn't surprise me if that doesn't end up happening, to where if you have a star more than, say, 20,000 light seconds from the main star, you could just do a quick micro jump over to there and then fly to any planets that are orbiting then that star. That would be a great idea to add to the game, by the way. Populate markets. Yeah, it does this. Quantities and prices. Be relatively predictable. It is way too predictable because, again, if you crash a trade route, log back in 24 hours later, and if nobody else has been doing it, it will be back where you started. And in fact, I think that it reaches equilibrium again within just a couple of hours of basically no player interactions with it. Generate interesting events. Again, I guess this is the system state changes. Maybe at one time this would have been like seeking luxuries or seeking weapons. I don't know if any of those exist anymore. These events can be used to create missions. Yeah, okay, I guess. But again, one version is going to be piracy with filch 6 gems or precious artwork or whatever from this convoy. And the next one's going to be rescue these 8 hostages from this convoy. Same mission, different text, because the system state is different, or your relationship with this faction versus that faction is different. I guess it could be argued that if they're, sectors are at war, it'll generate the convoy missions and conflict zones, stuff like that. Which, again, conflict zones are pretty much shooting fish in a barrel ad nauseum. Respond to player activities. Yeah, I guess it kind of does that to a little bit of an extent. Player activity should have a greater impact. I would make the argument that because the game economy for any particular system will essentially reset itself over a period of a few hours with no player involvement, kind of negates what the player can and cannot do. The only time where it really becomes apparent what the players are capable of doing is if you have a trade community goal and basically the resources become depleted because people are buying 5,000 units per hour, and you can only generate 1,000 units per hour. I'm just kind of throwing those numbers out there as an example. And then again, injected events, I'm going to assume that that's community goals and respond to generated effects. Now, this is where I think chain effects could be very interesting. Let's say in the current community goal with Professor Palin that he needs resonating separators. And you can go to Merope and get resonating separators. One system, basically one jump over for most ships. I think it's like 13 light years or something like that. Anyway, you come back and then 10, 12, 100 commanders are doing that same run, and within a few hours, it's basically unable to produce enough resonating separators to keep up with demand. Well, what should happen is a series of missions generated to, say, go get Gallite and ruthenium and, semiconductors. Bring them back, and that'll increase the production of resonating separators for that station, basically having a supply chain behind it. And then maybe that'll encourage people, and it would give miners more of an impact. Oh, hey, I know this community goal is going on here. It's not a mining community goal, but it is a trade community goal. Therefore, the nearest by stations that are producing this good or these goods are going to be needing mined resources. Other players could be bringing in materials, manufactured commodities, and stuff like that in order to fulfill this demand. And if players are completing these missions, are bringing in these materials at certain levels, instead of producing, say, 1,000 units per tick, it's producing 3,000 units per tick. Maybe you're still selling them at 5,000 units per tick, and that's not enough, but maybe eventually you could raise it up to where it is producing 6,000 or 7,000 units per tick versus only needing 5,000 or 6,000 units to reach equilibrium versus what's being bought to sell for the community goal. Just an idea there that I've thrown about in many different ways over time. So they give the type of governments. Yep, there's none. That's most of the galaxy. Anarchy, corporate state, religious cult. I remember seeing religious cult at one time. I think it's called theocracy or something like that. I think they're still in game, but I haven't seen one recently. Independent democracy, federal democracy, i.e. federal state, theocratic dictatorship, autocratic dictatorship, maybe it's theocratic dictatorship that I'm thinking of, communist dictatorship, feudal, imperial colony, and an imperial protectorate. I think that a lot of those got merged into patronage type government, so maybe not exactly with these terminologies, but pretty much those have been implemented. System states have been implemented. Economy, good, boom, bust, unrest, civil war. Threat of war, really not there. Markets, and then they talk about the wealth of a system, government types, regulate different aspects. Famine, entity is not able to support its own population through normal means. That typically only affects agricultural worlds, although other worlds could be importing food. But it doesn't appear to have any effect on population. It's not like if a famine's going on that system in the background sim will lose X number of population per hour. Again, it would be kind of interesting to have the ability to drive not only minor factions to 0% state for a length of time, at which point they disappear from the background simulation itself, but also same thing with inhabited systems. Hey, there's a system with 1,500 people. Folks aren't bringing food supplies to it. It can't grow its own food, and it loses, 50 pop per tick. And after however many ticks, there's no population left. They've all died. Maybe it would leave a permanent, an abandoned station, a permanent planetary settlement base, or I should say a permanent POI that's there that you could go visit. And as far as ruins go, and there's been scattered ruins for kind of this Formidine Rift mystery and some other, and the Hawkins Gap stuff as far as cinematic story narrative things out there. But wouldn't it be cool that if those could be dynamically created because players just simply didn't keep up with the demands of those stations and the people withered away and died, and then that system becomes uninhabited? This could have had a major impact when the Thargoids start invading here in the next week or two. And again, would give a more present thought. Oh crap, some of our favorite systems, the populations are being obliterated. As it stands right now, populations are set and determined by Frontier manually. This is not automatically considered into the background simulation. As far as I understand it, I may be wrong about that, but that's how I understand it. Drought. Drought is not in the game. All water production is removed. Market requirements for water increased. Water is now in the game. You can mine it in asteroid belts, in icy asteroid belts. Do that through ice mining. It would give more of a reason. Outbreak minor. A minor pandemic has broken out in the entity's markets. Cannot export food or medical items except machinery if applicable. Has a negative influence in standards. So they're talking about all these different. Most of these have been has been put out. Major outbreak, major and lethal pandemics break out. Cannot be exported. Demand for medical has negative influence on standing of living population and wealth. As far as I know, a major outbreak at a system does not affect its population. Again, I may be wrong about that, but that's my understanding. Outbreak apocalyptic. Extreme lethal and contagious disease widespread. They've had a couple of these simulated via community goal events, but markets cannot export anything. Market demand for medical items increased, has a negative influence on standing or living population and level of wealth. Development level is frozen. Weather severe. Severe weather, including earthquakes, stellar flare, and other natural disasters. As far as I know, weather is not in a type in the game. I have a feeling that if and when we get expanded planetary types or atmospheric landings, that might become more of something. And then special events. These are determined by case-by-case basis. For example, space weather doesn't exist. Talk about security, wealth, and then economies. We do have this industrial, military, civilian, mineral extraction. A couple of the terminology has changed, but that's all pretty much there. But it sounded like that there could have been these system states would have had a little bit more interesting. Security, wealth, bimodal simulation tech. The simulation runs in two distinct modes, although the evaluation of each mode generates the same events. The first is based on player activities. Once an activity type reaches a threshold for the entity, or minor faction as we call it today, the impact is applied and the events are generated. This does happen. As well as player effects, there are also periodic changes driven by the simulation itself. I have no idea. My guessing is that's why at 2 o'clock in the afternoon every day it seemed like whenever we were running or trying to purposely crash market economies to see if we could do it when the game first released, that was the simulation itself correcting itself via NPC background characters acting out as Keynesian economic actors. If you don't know what Keynesian economics are, well, go take a economics class. I'm not going to explain that here. Population size can be affected by events. Can it? My understanding is that no, population size can only be affected by events if the game admins and devs step in to change them. So maybe if a apocalyptic outbreak in a community goal happened and then nobody did that community goal, then maybe they would consider wiping out the planet, the population of that system. As far as I know, the number of inhabitants in a star system is static unless Frontier makes changes manually to that number. This would be something that would make basically settling Colonia and stuff like that a little bit more interesting, and with passenger missions to run colonists out to there and stuff like that. But at any rate, and I think standard of living and developmental levels and stuff like that, player activity thresholds, player activities associated volume for the entity are tallied into various influences. The influences have a direct effect on entity stats and tracked as followed: negative impact, positive impact. Yeah. Failed development missions, completed development missions. Okay. And then security, piracy, murdered, failed security missions, bounties collected, completed security missions. Well, I think that all of this are things that are in the background sim. Generated events. So threshold, this is the background simulation, and the ticks and the system states is what they're talking about here. Periodic change of each entity at a daily real-time tick. Okay, so that is exactly what I'm talking about. That at this daily reset, essentially, where it would be like any of the previous day's activities by the players would be magically just undone. And I don't know, this should be looked at, because a daily tick isn't necessarily bad, but maybe player activity should have one of those things to where instead of the NPCs instantly resetting things, it only resets a third, and then the next day another third and another third, so that if players were heavily involved in something, there's a more protracted sense of players therefore impacting that economy. But again, that would also involve the chain ripple effect of generating missions to bring in supplies in order to produce more of widget 1 versus widget 2. Rare goods, yeah, rare goods are in the game. It says rare goods can also be anything that the market produces. This can include ships and ship modules. Okay, yeah, certain stations are capable of stocking certain types of equipment and modules. Again, once you get to elite status and you can get access to Jameson Memorial, it becomes kind of a rather moot point. Restock markets. The markets are basically restocked over time. There are caps of maximum capacity for each commodity determined by market type. Larger stations can hold more goods for sale. These caps are also limit player sales. So if a market is already full of food, no more food can be sold to the market. I've never run into anything like that things are, stocked fully and can't accept any more of that. Injected events and interventions. Those are injected so that directly change in entity statistics. This mechanic can be used to add specific events to the game, like civil wars, economic collapse, and major story items, aka the community goal system, even though it doesn't always work. See the previous week's community goal for conflict zones, where the conflict zones very quickly got put into ceasefire for a couple of days until they fixed it. Calculating base prices. Base prices are initially calculated as a function of economy type, government type, development level, and population. Okay. This should also include distance from the star and player activity in a system. Prices have a universal minimum and maximum price cap to prevent catastrophic price failures and exploits. This should be relaxed a little bit. So if you take a look at what's proposed here in the background simulation, reset trace counters, inflation, an economy is not balanced, but is not a balanced system of check and balances, but a system of causes being used to generate effects. As such, there is a danger of inflation where players accumulate so much money that it is effectively devalued. This issue can only be completely eradicated if money is destroyed in the same quantity that's being created. As the game is focused on positive effects from a player's perspective with some negative effects, this is not an achievable goal. To combat inflation, there needs to be a suitable money sinks that the player spends money on reducing the cash in the player economy. Should be noted that players getting richer is not the same as inflation and is desirable. However, we should ensure that at all times there are an interesting spend choices. There really isn't. And at this point, inflation is out the bag because, let's see here, the broken slave trade during Gamma or Omega or whatever the hell the last Greek letter session was before the game went live. Very shortly thereafter live, you had Seeking Luxuries that was heavily abused. Sometime after that, you had Robigo, then you had Sothos Sios. Most recently, you've had Quint. There's been a couple of other ones I'm sure I've missed in between there. But at this point, that ship has sailed. Anybody that wants billions of credits have had it created out of ether. So, and again, there's no docking fees. There's no ship storage fees. There's placeholders that are 0 credit for these things. There's no fees to retrieve ships from storage, even though these were all suggested. So there could be some sinks put back into the game in order to, reduce this. Of course, you'd have some people complaining that, well, it just brings back the grind, because largely grinding for credits as far as monetary value goes is the sole seeming area of status. If you could say grind to settle a new planet with your activities, let's say by mining in a system that's uninhabited, and you drop a nav beacon in that system, well, that will encourage other NPC and or player explorers to come scan planetoids, maybe do some mining, do some surface prospecting, and eventually a few days or weeks of that activity would generate a settlement of some kind. And then eventually that settlement grows to the point where you can start trading with it. And then that grows into a bigger planetary settlement, and eventually an outpost, and then a station starts being constructed. And again, all of that handled by the background simulation. And I think that that's where the main weakness in this game really comes down to, in terms of overall design and not being well fleshed out. If some of these elements were added into the background simulation to where people could feel like they weren't just grinding for credits and there was nothing else to grind for, that they could be impacting along with their friends in some sort of social interaction type medium of, we're putting forth this effort and we're actually having an impact and an agency on the universe itself. Adding in things like hangars to buy to sit down route somewhere. And the fact that if you build these stations out, maybe you get a free slot where you can hangar a couple of your ships out there. It would give people a reason for engaging in activities, and especially activities like mining, other than for having to unlock an engineer or because they find it cathartic. And, I would have a reason to go equip mining lasers from time to time, maybe, especially if I was working as part of a player group. And something like that would mean I would join a new player group, probably, or start my own, in order to get people to work together around a common goal that they could see achieved from within the game without having to petition the developers to set up a community goal to do it for them. And this should be part of the game, naturally going about playing it. Well, this episode has run fairly long. Okay, they're going to be talking about factions here. And I think that I'm going to go ahead and cut this episode here and come back to this because we're already at about 30 minutes. And you've probably heard me ramble on enough here. Yeah. So join us next time and we'll be looking at factions and the background sim in more depth and detail.